January 4, 1974, dawned like any other winter morning in Seattle. The rain-soaked streets glistened under the pale light of dawn, devoid of the hustle that would soon engulf them. In a small apartment, a horrific scene was unfolding, one that would mark the beginning of a terrifying journey into the heart of darkness. Karen Sparks, a young woman, lay brutally beaten and sexually assaulted in her own home, her life hanging by a thread. The assault on Karen Sparks was the first documented crime linked to a monster who would later become infamous as Ted Bundy. The sound of sirens pierced the morning air as police and emergency services rushed to the scene. The apartment, once a sanctuary, was now a crime scene, filled with the stark remnants of violence. Blood stained the sheets, and the air was thick with the scent of fear. Karen, though severely injured, managed to give the police a description of her attacker, a description that would later prove to be hauntingly familiar. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Seattle witnessed a series of similar attacks. Young women, all with a similar profile, began to vanish. The disappearance of Linda and Healy in February 1974 sent shockwaves through the community. Her room, found in disarray, told the tale of a struggle that ended in her disappearance. The police were now dealing with a potential serial killer, a realization that sent a chill down the spines of the investigators. Detectives were baffled by the lack of evidence and the seemingly random nature of the attacks. The only clue was a description of a man who seemed to blend into the crowd with ease. The city was gripped by fear, as no one knew when or where the next attack would occur. The quiet days of Seattle were now filled with an undercurrent of terror. In the midst of this chaos, a figure watched and waited. Ted Bundy, a man with a charming smile and an intellect that belied his monstrous actions, was just beginning his reign of terror. His crimes would span states, leaving behind a trail of bodies and shattered lives. But on this cold January morning, as Karen Sparks fought for her life, no one could have predicted the horror that was to unfold. The rain continued to fall, washing away the footprints of a monster, but the city would soon learn that some stains could never be washed away. As the investigation into Karen's assault and the disappearance of Linda and Healy deepened, the police were about to embark on a journey that would lead them down a dark path, a path that would challenge everything they thought they knew about humanity. And in the shadows, Ted Bundy waited, his eyes fixed on his next victim, his heart beating with an anticipation that only the darkest of souls could understand. The city slept, unaware of the evil that lurked among them, an evil that would soon strike again. The city of Seattle was a bustling metropolis, its streets lined with the sounds of coffee shops and the smell of freshly cut flowers. But beneath its picturesque surface, a sense of unease settled over the residents, like a thin layer of frost on a winter morning. It was January 1974, and the disappearance of Linda and Healy had left the community reeling. The 21-year-old University of Washington student had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a faint trail of clues. Linda was a bright and ambitious young woman, with a passion for music and a love for the outdoors. She was a senior at the University of Washington, studying psychology and sociology, and was known for her kind and gentle nature. Her friends and family described her as a free spirit, always eager to explore new places and try new things. But on the night of her disappearance, Linda's usual routine had been disrupted. She had attended a concert at the university's auditorium, and then had gone to a friend's house to watch a movie. It was there that she received a phone call, and shortly after, she left to go home. The streets of Seattle were quiet that night, the only sound being the distant hum of cars driving by. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a misty fog that shrouded the city in an eerie silence. Linda walked alone, her feet clicking on the wet pavement, as she made her way back to her apartment. She lived in a small studio on Northeast 42nd Street, just a few blocks away from the university. The building was a nondescript two-story structure, with a faded sign that creaked in the wind. As Linda approached her apartment, she noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, calling out to see if anyone was there. But there was no answer. The apartment was dimly lit, the only sound being the creaking of the old wooden floorboards. Linda's heart began to beat faster, as she sensed that something was off. She took a step back, her eyes scanning the empty hallway, and that's when she saw it. A piece of paper on the floor, with a cryptic message scrawled on it. The message was a simple one, just a few words that seemed to make no sense. But to Linda, it was a warning, a signal that something was terribly wrong. She felt a chill run down her spine, as she realized that she was not alone. And then, everything went black. The next morning, Linda's roommate reported her missing, and the police launched an investigation. They found Linda's apartment in disarray, with signs of a struggle. But there was no sign of Linda, no indication of where she had gone or what had happened to her. The police were baffled, and the community was left to wonder if they were dealing with a serial killer. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Linda continued. The police scoured the city, looking for any sign of her, but she seemed to have vanished into thin air. And then, on January 4, 1974, another woman was attacked, just a few blocks away from Linda's apartment. Karen Sparks, a 19-year-old student, was found severely beaten and sexually assaulted in her apartment. The police realized that they were dealing with a serial attacker, and the city of Seattle was thrown into a state of panic. The investigation into Linda's disappearance and Karen's attack was ongoing, but the police were no closer to catching the perpetrator. The city was on edge, and the residents were living in fear. And then, just as the police thought they were making progress, another woman disappeared. It was as if the killer was toying with them, leaving behind a trail of clues that seemed to lead nowhere. The city of Seattle was gripped with fear, as the police struggled to catch the killer. And in the midst of it all, Ted Bundy watched and waited, his eyes fixed on his next victim. The game was on, and the stakes were higher than ever before. And as the sun set over the city, the residents wondered who would be next. January 4, 1974, was a chilly winter morning in Seattle. The city was still reeling from the disappearance of Linda and Healy, a 22-year-old student who had vanished from her apartment just a few days earlier. As the police continued their search for Linda, another disturbing incident was unfolding just a few blocks away. Karen Sparks, a 19-year-old student, was found severely beaten and sexually assaulted in her apartment. The police were called to the scene, and as they arrived, they noticed that the door was unlocked and the apartment was in disarray. The officers carefully made their way inside, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of what might have happened. They found Karen lying on the floor, her body battered and bruised. The air was thick with the smell of blood and sweat. The police immediately called for an ambulance, and Karen was rushed to the hospital. As they waited for the paramedics to arrive, the officers began to survey the crime scene. They noticed that the room had been ransacked, with clothes and furniture scattered all over the floor. The police were baffled by the brutality of the attack. Karen's injuries were severe, and it was clear that she had put up a fierce struggle. The officers found bloodstains on the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. It was as if the attacker had been in a frenzy, determined to inflict as much harm as possible. As the police continued to investigate, they found a piece of torn fabric caught in the window lock. It was a small clue, but it might be the only lead they had to catch the perpetrator. The news of Karen's attack sent shockwaves through the city. The residents of Seattle were already on edge, worried about the safety of their daughters and sisters. The police were under immense pressure to catch the attacker, but they had few leads to go on. The only thing they knew for certain was that the attacker was still out there, waiting for his next victim. As the sun began to set on Seattle, the city was gripped with fear. People locked their doors and windows, wondering if they would be the next target. The police were working around the clock, following up on every lead, no matter how small. They were determined to catch the attacker, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. The attacker seemed to be always one step ahead, leaving behind few clues and no witnesses. The police were faced with a daunting task, but they were driven by a sense of justice and a desire to protect the people of Seattle. As the night wore on, the city held its breath, waiting for the next move of the attacker. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the city, making everyone feel vulnerable. The police patrols were increased, and the officers were on high alert, watching for any sign of suspicious activity. But despite their best efforts, the city felt like a tinderbox, waiting to be ignited. And then, just as the night seemed to be winding down, the police received a call that would change everything. A woman had reported seeing a suspicious person lurking around the university district. The police rushed to the scene, their hearts racing with anticipation. And as they arrived, they saw a figure in the distance, walking away from them. He was tall, with dark hair, and a charming smile. The police didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the face of evil. He was walking away, disappearing into the night, leaving behind a trail of terror that would haunt the city for years to come. And as the police watched, he vanished into the darkness, gone. As the darkness of January 4, 1974, began to lift, the city of Seattle awoke to a sense of unease. Karen Sparks, a young woman, had been severely beaten and sexually assaulted in her apartment, leaving her with permanent brain damage. The attack was the first documented crime linked to a serial offender, and it marked the beginning of a terrifying journey for the people of Seattle. The police were faced with a daunting task: to track down the perpetrator and bring him to justice. Detective Robert D. Keppel of the King County Sheriff's Office was assigned to the case. He began by reviewing the crime scene, taking in the smallest details: the shattered glass, the torn fabric, the faint scent of perfume. The room was a mess, with clothes scattered everywhere, and a broken lamp lay on the floor. But it was the small, seemingly insignificant things that caught Keppel's attention: a thread of fabric caught in the window lock, a faint smudge of lipstick on the edge of the bedside table. These tiny clues would become crucial in the hunt for the attacker. As the investigation unfolded, the police discovered that Karen Sparks was not the only victim. Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old student, had disappeared on February 1, 1974, and her body was later found in a remote area. The police suspected that they were dealing with a serial killer, and the city was gripped with fear. The sound of sirens echoed through the streets, and the once peaceful neighborhoods were now filled with an air of tension. People locked their doors, fearful of the darkness that lurked outside. The police were working around the clock, following every lead, every tip, every hint of a clue. They interviewed witnesses, scoured the crime scenes, and analyzed the evidence. But the killer seemed to be always one step ahead, leaving behind only the faintest whispers of his presence. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of a car. And then, on August 16, 1975, the police received a break in the case. A suspicious person had been pulled over in Utah, and the officer had found a fake police badge and handcuffs in his car. The suspect was none other than Theodore Robert Bundy, a charismatic and handsome young man with a quick smile and a silver tongue. The police had finally found their man, but they had no idea what they were up against. As the investigation continued, the police discovered that Bundy was not just a suspect, he was a master manipulator, a chameleon who could blend in seamlessly with his surroundings. He had a charm that was disarming, a way of making people trust him, of making them believe that he was harmless. But beneath the surface, Bundy was a monster, a killer who had no qualms about taking lives. The police were faced with a daunting task: to unravel the threads of Bundy's crimes, to follow the trail of clues that he had left behind. It was a complex web of deceit and manipulation, and the police had to be careful not to get caught in its snare. They worked tirelessly, following every lead, every hint of a clue, and slowly but surely, they began to build a case against Bundy. But just as they thought they had him cornered, Bundy slipped away, escaping from a county jail in Aspen, Colorado, on June 7, 1977. The police were left stunned, wondering how they had let him slip through their fingers. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the corridors of the jail, and the police were left to pick up the pieces. The manhunt was on, with police scouring the country, searching for any sign of Bundy. And then, on January 15, 1978, the unthinkable happened. Bundy struck again, this time at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. The attack was brutal, leaving 2 women dead and several others injured. The police knew that they had to act fast, to catch Bundy before he struck again. The investigation was intense, with police working around the clock to track down the killer. They followed every lead, every tip, every hint of a clue. And finally, on February 12, 1978, they got their man. Bundy was arrested in Florida, and the city could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But as the police looked into Bundy's eyes, they saw something that chilled them to the bone: a glint of amusement, a spark of triumph. It was as if he knew that he had gotten away with it, that he had outsmarted the police once again. And in that moment, the police knew that they had to be vigilant, to make sure that Bundy would never again be free to kill. The trial was a dramatic and intense affair, with Bundy representing himself in court. He was charismatic and confident, but the prosecution was determined to bring him down. And in the end, justice was served. Bundy was found guilty of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. As the years passed, Bundy's story became a legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of charm and manipulation. But for the police, it was a reminder of the importance of diligence and perseverance. They had worked tirelessly to bring Bundy to justice, and in the end, they had succeeded. But the story of Ted Bundy is not just a story of crime and punishment, it is a story of the darkness that lurks within us all. It is a reminder that even the most charming and charismatic people can hide a monster beneath the surface. And it is a warning that we should never trust our instincts, that we should always be vigilant, always be aware of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. As the darkness closed in around him, Ted Bundy's eyes gleamed with a malevolent intensity, and the police knew that they had finally caught a glimpse of the real Ted Bundy. And in that moment, they knew that they would never forget the terror that he had unleashed upon the world. The sound of the prison door slamming shut behind him was a sound of finality, a sound that marked the end of a reign of terror. But as the police walked away from the prison, they couldn't shake off the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of a much larger, much darker story. And as they disappeared into the night, the city was left to wonder, what other secrets lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered? As the investigation into Ted Bundy's crimes continued, detectives delved deeper into the dark territory of his mind. The charismatic killer had left a trail of bodies across the country, and it was up to the investigators to piece together the evidence and uncover the truth. In Seattle, where it all began, Detective Robert D. Keppel pored over the files of missing women, searching for any connection to Bundy. The sound of papers shuffling, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the smell of stale coffee filled the air as Keppel worked tirelessly to crack the case. In Utah, Sergeant Mike Reynolds was working to build a case against Bundy for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranche. The young woman had managed to escape from Bundy's clutches, but not before he had threatened to kill her. Reynolds knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg, and that Bundy was capable of much worse. As he interviewed Duranche, he noticed the fear in her eyes, the tremble of her voice, and the way she hesitated before answering each question. The memory of that night was still etched in her mind, and Reynolds could sense the terror that lingered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, in Colorado, authorities were dealing with the aftermath of Bundy's escape from the county jail. He had slipped away unnoticed, leaving behind only a few clues. The search was on, with officers scouring the countryside, searching for any sign of the elusive killer. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the distant howl of a siren filled the air as the manhunt intensified. It was a cat-and-mouse game, with Bundy always one step ahead of his pursuers. As the investigation continued, disturbing evidence began to emerge. In Florida, detectives found a stash of bloody clothing and a fake police badge, which they believed belonged to Bundy. The clothes were stained with the blood of his victims, and the badge was a chilling reminder of the tactics he used to lure them to their deaths. The badge glinted in the light, its metal surface reflecting the horror of the crimes it had facilitated. In a nearby wooded area, searchers discovered a human skull, later identified as that of a young woman who had gone missing months earlier. The skull was a grim reminder of the brutality of Bundy's crimes, and the devastating impact they had on the families of his victims. The discovery of the skull sent shockwaves through the community, and the police knew they had to act fast. They launched a massive manhunt, scouring the woods and searching for any sign of Bundy. The sound of helicopters overhead, the barking of dogs, and the rustle of leaves filled the air as the search party combed the area. It was a desperate bid to catch the killer before he struck again, and the tension was palpable. As the sun began to set on another day in the investigation, detectives were no closer to catching their man. But they refused to give up, driven by a fierce determination to bring Bundy to justice. The silence of the evening was broken only by the sound of papers shuffling, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the quiet murmur of conversation. It was a moment of calm before the storm, a brief respite from the chaos that had engulfed the lives of so many. And then, just as the darkness was about to consume them, a phone call came in, a whisper of a lead, a hint of a sighting. Bundy was spotted in a stolen Volkswagen Beetle, driving down a deserted highway, the darkness closing in around him like a shroud. The investigation into Ted Bundy's whereabouts had been ongoing for weeks, with leads pouring in from all corners of the country. The police were working tirelessly, following every tip, no matter how small, in the hopes of finally apprehending the elusive killer. The sound of phones ringing, papers shuffling, and the constant hum of the fluorescent lights filled the air as the detectives worked around the clock. In a small, cramped room, a team of investigators pored over a map of the United States, marking every location where a sighting had been reported. The map was a sea of red pins, each one representing a potential lead, a possible glimpse of the killer. The team worked in silence, their eyes scanning the map, searching for any pattern, any connection that might lead them to Bundy. Suddenly, a phone rang, breaking the silence. A detective answered, his voice firm and authoritative. "Yes, we're interested in any information you might have." The room fell silent as the detective listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he scribbled down some notes. "Okay, thank you for calling. We'll send someone over right away." The detective hung up the phone and turned to the team. "We've got a possible sighting in California. A woman claims to have seen Bundy at a gas station just outside of Los Angeles. The room erupted into a flurry of activity as the team quickly assembled a plan to investigate the lead. A team of detectives was dispatched to California, armed with a photograph of Bundy and a description of the car he was believed to be driving. They arrived at the gas station, a small, run-down building on the side of the highway. The attendant, a nervous-looking man with a scruffy beard, greeted them. "Yeah, I think I saw the guy you're looking for. He was in here yesterday, filling up his tank." The detectives showed the attendant the photograph, and he nodded enthusiastically. "That's him, that's the guy." The team's excitement grew as they realized they might finally have found their man. They began to search the area, scouring the streets and questioning locals. But as the day wore on, the lead began to unravel. The attendant's description of the car didn't match the one Bundy was known to be driving, and the witness who had reported the sighting was nowhere to be found. The team's excitement turned to frustration as they realized they had been chasing a false lead. As the sun began to set, the detectives gathered back at the station, exhausted and demoralized. They had been so sure they had finally found Bundy, but it seemed they were back to square one. The room was silent, the only sound the quiet rustling of papers and the occasional sigh. And then, just as they were about to pack up and call it a day, a phone call came in. "We've got a report of a stolen Volkswagen Beetle, spotted driving down a deserted highway in Florida." The room fell silent, the detectives' eyes locking onto each other. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? The line went dead, leaving the detectives with only one haunting question: was this finally the end of the road for Ted Bundy? The darkness that drove Ted Bundy to commit such heinous crimes is a labyrinth of psychological complexities, a twisted web of motivations that would take experts years to unravel. As investigators delved deeper into his psyche, they discovered a chilling pattern of behavior, a calculated approach to hunting and killing that was both meticulous and brutal. The sound of his Volkswagen Beetle's engine, the rustle of leaves beneath his feet, and the faint scent of cologne on his skin all became synonymous with terror, a harbinger of doom for the young women who crossed his path. Bundy's modus operandi was a masterclass in manipulation, a delicate dance of charm and deception that lured his victims into a false sense of security. He would feign injury or disability, using his charisma to gain their trust, before striking with ruthless efficiency. The snap of a twig, the creak of a door, and the soft whisper of his voice all became instruments of fear, a symphony of terror that would haunt his victims' families for generations to come. As one investigator noted, he was a chameleon, able to blend into his surroundings with ease, leaving behind a trail of destruction that was both calculated and random. The psychological profile of Ted Bundy is a fascinating and terrifying case study, a glimpse into the mind of a serial killer who defied conventional explanations. He was a man of contradictions, a complex web of emotions and motivations that would take years to unravel. On the surface, he was charming and affable, a charismatic individual who could effortlessly manipulate those around him. But beneath this facade lay a darker, more sinister personality, a man driven by insatiable hunger for power and control. As Dr. James Dobson, a renowned psychologist, observed, Bundy's behavior was a classic example of a narcissistic personality disorder, a grandiose sense of self-importance that was both captivating and terrifying. The sequence of events that led to his crimes is a harrowing tale of calculated precision, a step-by-step guide to murder that would leave even the most seasoned investigators shaken. It began with a careful selection of victims, young women with long hair and a trusting nature, who would be lured into his trap by a combination of charm and deception. Once he had gained their trust, he would strike, using a combination of force and cunning to subdue them. The sound of their screams, the feel of their skin beneath his fingers, and the smell of their fear all became intoxicating stimuli, a potent cocktail of emotions that would drive him to commit even more heinous crimes. As the investigation into Bundy's crimes continued, a darker revelation began to emerge, a sinister pattern of behavior that would haunt the dreams of even the most seasoned detectives. It became clear that Bundy's crimes were not just random acts of violence, but a carefully calculated attempt to assert his power and control over his victims. The way he would meticulously plan and execute his attacks, the way he would toy with his victims before killing them, all pointed to a deeper, more sinister motivation. As one detective noted, he was a predator, a hunter who stalked his prey with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction that would never be fully understood. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Bundy continued to deny his crimes, a bizarre and twisted attempt to maintain his innocence in the face of overwhelming proof. It was a tactic that would ultimately prove to be his downfall, as investigators began to unravel the complex web of lies and deceit that he had spun around himself. The sound of his voice, the look in his eyes, and the words that flowed from his lips all became a twisted game of cat and mouse, a desperate attempt to evade justice and maintain his freedom. As the sun set on another day in the investigation, the detectives gathered around the conference table, their faces etched with exhaustion and frustration. They had been so close to catching Bundy, only to have him slip through their fingers once again. But they refused to give up, driven by a fierce determination to bring him to justice. And then, just as they were about to pack up and call it a day, a phone call came in, a chilling message that would change everything. "We've found a body, and it's one of Bundy's victims." The room fell silent, the only sound the quiet rustling of papers and the occasional sigh. The darkness that had driven Ted Bundy to commit such heinous crimes was finally beginning to unravel, and the truth was more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. The phone on the table rang again, its shrill tone piercing the silence, and a single word was spoken: "Run." The darkness that shrouded the streets of Tallahassee, Florida, on January 15, 1978, was palpable. It was as if the very presence of Ted Bundy had cast a shadow over the city, a shadow that would soon reveal its true horrors. The Chi Omega sorority house, a sanctuary for young women, was about to become the site of one of the most brutal attacks in American history. Bundy, driven by an insatiable hunger for destruction, had been stalking the streets, searching for his next victim. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the crowds, homing in on the unsuspecting students of Florida State University. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the sorority house, a stark contrast to the evil that lurked outside. As the night wore on, Bundy's presence became more pronounced, his footsteps echoing through the deserted streets. He moved with a purpose, his heart racing with anticipation. The sorority house, with its rows of windows and open doors, was an easy target, a vulnerable haven for the young women who lived there. The first attack came without warning, a brutal onslaught that left 2 women dead and several others injured. The sound of screams and shattering glass filled the air, a chilling melody that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Bundy, his face twisted in a grotesque grin, moved from room to room, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The investigation that followed was a frantic scramble to piece together the events of that fateful night. Detectives combed the crime scene, searching for clues, while the survivors struggled to come to terms with the trauma they had endured. The police were faced with a daunting task: to track down a killer who seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of his presence. As the days turned into weeks, the authorities began to close in on Bundy. A composite sketch, compiled from eyewitness accounts, was circulated, and the public was urged to come forward with any information. The phone lines were flooded with tips, each one meticulously vetted by the detectives. And then, on February 12, 1978, the call came in that would change everything. Ted Bundy had been spotted in a stolen Volkswagen Beetle, driving erratically through the streets of Pensacola. The police swooped in, surrounding the vehicle, and Bundy, realizing the game was up, surrendered without a fight. The man who had evaded capture for so long, who had left a trail of death and destruction in his wake, was finally behind bars. But as he sat in his cell, a sly smile spreading across his face, it became clear that this was far from the end. The darkness that had driven Ted Bundy to commit such heinous crimes still lingered, waiting to be unleashed once more. And as the detectives delved deeper into the mind of the killer, they began to unravel the complex web of lies and deceit that had defined his life. The sound of his voice, the look in his eyes, and the words that flowed from his lips all became a twisted game of cat and mouse, a desperate attempt to evade justice and maintain his freedom. But the truth was slowly beginning to emerge, a truth that would reveal the true extent of Bundy's depravity. The phone on the detective's desk rang, shrill and insistent, piercing the silence. A single word was spoken, a word that would change everything: confession. The darkness that had driven Ted Bundy to commit such heinous crimes still lingered, waiting to be unleashed once more. As he sat in his cell, a sly smile spreading across his face, it became clear that this was far from the end. The sound of his voice, low and gravelly, sent shivers down the spines of the detectives who had finally captured him. They had been searching for him for years, following a trail of blood and tears that stretched from the Pacific Northwest to the sun-kissed beaches of Florida. The phone on the detective's desk rang, shrill and insistent, piercing the silence. A single word was spoken, a word that would change everything: confession. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the detective as he listened intently to the voice on the other end of the line. The words were few, but their impact was immense. Ted Bundy, the man who had evaded capture for so long, was ready to talk. The detectives exchanged skeptical glances, their minds racing with the implications. What would he say? Would he finally reveal the truth behind the countless murders that had been attributed to him? The questions swirled in their minds like a maelstrom, each one more urgent than the last. As they made their way to the interrogation room, the air grew thick with anticipation. The door creaked open, and Ted Bundy looked up, his eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. The detectives took their seats, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on the man who had haunted their dreams for so long. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. And then, in a voice that was almost casual, Ted Bundy began to speak. The words flowed from his lips like a river, each one a testament to the depravity that had driven him to commit such unspeakable crimes. The detectives listened, transfixed, as the truth began to emerge. The sound of his voice was mesmerizing, a gentle breeze that belied the horror of his actions. But as the hours ticked by, the words began to paint a picture of a man who was beyond redemption, a man who had surrendered to his darkest impulses. The room was a confessional, a place where secrets were revealed and truths were told. The detectives were the priests, their faces impassive, their eyes absorbing every word. And Ted Bundy, the sinner, was finally unburdening himself of the weight that had driven him to commit such atrocities. The air was heavy with the weight of his confession, each word a testament to the darkness that had consumed him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a golden glow, the detectives finally understood the true extent of Ted Bundy's depravity. The man who had sat before them, smiling and charming, was a monster, a creature driven by a hunger for blood and a thirst for destruction. The truth was finally out, and it was more terrifying than they had ever imagined. And as they left the interrogation room, the sound of Ted Bundy's voice still echoing in their minds, they knew that they had finally uncovered the secrets of the serial killer who had haunted their dreams for so long. But as they walked out into the cool night air, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the darkness that had driven Ted Bundy was still out there, waiting to strike again. The darkness closed in, like a shroud, and the detectives knew that they would never be able to escape its grasp. The last sound they heard was the soft whisper of Ted Bundy's voice, his final words hanging in the air like a challenge, "I'm not the only one." The trial of Ted Bundy was a culmination of years of investigation, a painstaking process of gathering evidence and piecing together the puzzle of his crimes. On July 30, 1979, the jury delivered a verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of justice finally being served. Bundy's expression, however, remained eerily calm, a testament to the darkness that lurked beneath his charismatic facade. As the judge handed down the sentence, death by electric chair, the weight of the verdict settled over the courtroom like a shroud. The families of the victims, who had endured unimaginable pain and suffering, finally had closure. But the impact of Bundy's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's psyche. The idea that a monster like Bundy could hide in plain sight, masquerading as a normal, even charming, individual, sent shockwaves of fear through communities across America. The years that followed saw a significant shift in the way law enforcement approached serial killer cases. The Bundy investigation had highlighted the importance of interagency cooperation, the need for a more proactive approach to tracking and apprehending serial offenders. The creation of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, tasked with developing profiles of serial killers, was a direct response to the lessons learned from the Bundy case. As the news of Bundy's conviction and sentencing spread, a sense of catharsis washed over the nation. But for those who had been closest to the case, the detectives, the prosecutors, and the families of the victims, the emotional scars would take years to heal. They had glimpsed the abyss, stared into the face of pure evil, and emerged forever changed. In the years leading up to his execution, Bundy's demeanor underwent a transformation. The charismatic, confident individual who had once swaggered through the courtroom was replaced by a man who seemed increasingly withdrawn, haunted by the ghosts of his own making. And yet, even as he faced the ultimate reckoning, Bundy's mask of charm and charisma never fully slipped. It was as if he was determined to maintain the illusion, to convince himself and others that he was still the master of his own twisted universe. The day of reckoning finally arrived on January 24, 1989. As the sun rose over the Florida State Prison, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The man who had committed some of the most heinous crimes in American history was about to meet his maker. The electric chair, a device designed to deliver a fatal shock, stood waiting, its metal straps and electrodes a cold, unforgiving testament to the gravity of Bundy's crimes. As the guards led him to the execution chamber, Bundy's eyes locked onto the witnesses gathered behind the glass partition. For a moment, his gaze seemed to bore into their very souls, a last, defiant gesture of a man who had spent his life defying the norms of humanity. And then, in an instant, it was over. The switch was thrown, the current flowed, and Ted Bundy's reign of terror came to an end. The room was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the electric chair. The witnesses, their faces etched with a mix of emotions, slowly began to file out of the chamber. As they emerged into the bright Florida sunlight, they were met with a chorus of questions from the waiting reporters. But for one detective, who had spent years tracking Bundy, there was only one thought: the haunting memory of the killer's final words, spoken in the darkness of the interrogation room, still echoing in his mind, "I'm not the only one."